The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes with Plein Air and Fine Art Connoisseur magazines. I was on the phone one day with the great artist Scott Christensen. I said, Scott, who out there is really crushing it? Who do you really love as a painter? He said, Christine Lashley. You got to do something with Christine. So we brought her into the Plein Air Convention and we did a video called Paintings That Sparkle. Here you're going to get a sample of that now.
Hi, Christine Lashley. I'm here to help you to learn how to add pizzazz and sparkle to your paintings today. And we're going to be creating a painting of a rainy street scene with bright city lights and have some fun with that. So I've been painting for about 20 years. I would say 10 years seriously working on my paintings and my oils. Prior to that, I was really a watercolor painter and I didn't work in oils. And that's really where I learned about the power of how to create light and get the vibrancy in your paintings. And I also lived in Seattle where it rains a lot. The myth is true. And I would be driving to and from where I needed to be, and especially at nighttime, it was just very exciting to see all of the lights and the dripping reflections, the refraction of some of the light coming through the glass. So that was the idea for my video, to show you more about how to get that look, and not just for city scenes, but this could translate into maybe sun sparkling on water, or if you wanted to get extra dynamic qualities for some of your other type of paintings that would just need that extra push. Let's talk about getting inspired for our painting project ahead. First thing that I like to do is review a lot of the photos that I've taken. Those might include photographs I've taken before, and based on the idea that I have in my head and maybe some of the photos, I actually might go and seek some other reference. I gather most of my reference for city night paintings with photographic reference, and it's a few plein air studies that I do. But there are times that I've painted plein air for nocturnes or cityscapes. And so I just like to talk about that for a minute. An easy thing that you can do to prepare for a painting that you're going to create is go out, experience the scene, maybe make a quick memory study, and I'll show you a little bit about that later, or just make a quick study if you have your paint equipment. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It could even be as simple as just a black and white study, making sure you capture certain key shapes and maybe even jot down some words that excited you about the scene, such as golden glow, very blue sky, I saw shades of purple. That might be enough to augment what you see in your photos later. When I'm painting plein air, and the paintings that I've done that are nocturnes on location, or also twilight is a great time to paint, dawn as well. So all of those kind of transitional times where you have lighting that is casting a lot of interest in the scene. I like to take photo reference, as I mentioned, but the best is if you could be working plein air, and those times are so fleeting. The sun rises for only a few minutes or sets for a few minutes. So a great way to do it, and this is what has worked for me for plein air events, is to see what I'm going to paint, be excited about it, take notes, fully commit to remembering what is my lightest light, my darkest dark, the key components of what got me excited to paint this scene in the first place. Ideally, it's great to go set up the next day. So let's say it's sunset and you see a scene that is very exciting. Plan to be there ahead of time the next day. Also, if you still need more time to finish your scene, you can paint it dawn the following morning. So that's really been a help for me painting at the plein air events. And I did my painting Atlanta Rush this way. I worked from the darkness into the light, and I could pick the exact moment where I had the sky the color I wanted. I knew the lights were going to be the most important. And also my painting Twilight Libby Hill. That was painted over 2 evenings and 1 dawn. And the sky changed each time, and one time it rained, so that was a bonus. I said, oh, there's my rainy street, I'm going to do that. Twilight Libby Hill is one of my favorite paintings I've done outdoors. It was a large piece. I was excited to be there, but I actually wasn't feeling that great, and so I wanted to be close to my host home in case I needed to go and rest. So I'd like to take this moment of time before we even start our project to just make sure you understand that just showing up at the easel and going through the motions of starting your painting, even if you're not sure how it's going to turn out, just go and do it. You can do it. And I wouldn't have created that painting if I hadn't really pushed myself to just drag out my equipment and get everything started. So I often look at that painting and think it wouldn't have happened if I just didn't show up at the easel. I put together a collection of photos that I shot in different cities around the world. And even though we're talking about creating drama in your paintings, there's something exciting about travel, and whether I'm painting inside, it doesn't just have to be a rainy street scene or a high drama situation with a lot of dark and a little bit of light. These are just moments that I sometimes equate drama in a painting with being in a different location. There's something exciting about travel that I guess that comes out in my paintings. So we're going to look at a collection of scenes. Let's start with looking at my collection of photos that I have put together from Portland. And I just want to start talking about good photos and bad photos. And Portland, I knew this is Portland, Oregon, because I know there's Portland, Maine as well. So Portland, Oregon is a city that I can pretty much count on to be rain, and rain brings out some of the sparkliness of the lights that are happening in the city. And even if it's a less than perfect situation, not those transitional times that I was talking about where we have early hours or later hours, it could just be gray and rather drab. I shot the footage, and rain was pretty much only happening during the midday hours. In the Portland photos we're going to take a look at, there's one that has, you want to position yourself so that you can capture a lot of photos. So, and then you can just sort through them later, especially if you're dodging between raindrops or between awnings. You want to make sure you get just a bunch of shots, and then you can see which ones are going to work later. So what we're looking for is basically start looking for an interesting sky shape. So we want a V or a U or some type of good marker of what area is light and what area is dark. Try to have some glowing car lights if you can. Look for figures. Also, you want to avoid stacked images. For example, I have a photo here of a person, and it looks like a car is kind of growing out of the person. And so this unfortunate T shape is not going to make a good painting. You really can't save that. It just creates a snag for the viewer's eye. Something as simple as a strong vertical line coming out of a figure, or just tangent edges. Watch out for what I call kissing edges. You want to make sure you don't have to keep everything separated, of course. There's a lot of overlap, but you just want to avoid those type of weird edges. So when you're gathering your reference for your painting, I sometimes think of separate elements. I think of good reflections, good building shapes, good sky shapes, and good figures, also good cars. So I have a couple of different collections of photos to just look at quickly here. It's pretty interesting that you can establish if the figures are going to work well in your painting or not. I just like to have the figures be mostly either dark or light. And so you also want a good shape to your figures. They shouldn't be too close to the edge of the camera. So I have some reference here of not very good figures in New York. And then we have a photo of good figures in New York. And you can see that it's more silhouette and the shape is just more interesting of the collection of people. Speaking of figures, I'd like to look at this picture of a cafe. You can see that all of the people that are standing, pretty much their heads are all aligned, similar to the photo that we saw in New York. And all of the people that are sitting down at the cafe, those heads are all in a line too. So watch out for things that line up. As far as human heads, you actually want to organize some of your shapes that way. Sometimes if people are walking up a hill or down a hill, that can change. Obviously, if somebody is tall or short, such as mom and child walking down the street, that will affect things as well. And we looked and saw in the scene in New York, I've drawn a line for you as to the top of the heads, and notice that the feet actually are at varied levels. So those walking figures in New York, that's in fact what happens. That's figures in perspective. And a big pitfall is trying to keep the figures too separated. So in addition to just watching out where the head area is falling in general, you want to try to stack your figures so that maybe somebody's shoulder is touching, or we have groups of figures. If you notice in these two examples of figures, we have figures that are closer together and then figures that are spaced apart, but they're in groupings. In addition to the V shape of the sky helping you to start out with perspective, there's some very simple lines, especially if you have a view just looking down the street. You can look for the curb to help you out with understanding perspective. But the V shape of the sky should help you get started on your perspective. I have a diagram here that shows just simple lines going in perspective. It really will help to make your scene more believable, and then you can start having fun with your shapes, with the figures and all of the lights that you see in a cityscape. We also have some photos to look at as to shapes of buildings, and you want to avoid a really large, huge, chunky looking shape. Even if the lights are interesting, even if you have good reflections, you want to have an area of interest, such as the sky that I mentioned before, but also little shop fronts or awnings. Those all make for just different patterns that you can play with later in your painting. This photo of Ponce City Market, even though I had great reference for the street and so forth, I decided the building was just way too clunky looking and I couldn't really do that much with it, even through cropping in and trying to extract some of the fun reflections out of that. And then we have a photo of just a humble parking lot that has great water reflections. They're so interesting. I think it would make a really good painting just to play with those water reflections. You can also look at just the pattern of the pavement. That alone, with the puddling of the water and all of the abstract shapes, again, lots of fun to be had there, cropping in and doing different things. You can also, as I mentioned before, splice together, let's say, a little bit more of a gray scene where you have an interesting shape to the sky or the buildings are doing something interesting. Maybe you could turn that into a nocturne. So you could take a photo such as the scene here where it's an interesting shape to the buildings and the sky, but combine that with some interesting reflections, and I think you'd have a good painting by combining those two. You have to be a little careful of not combining too many things. I think then it starts to get a little crazy, but it's just a way to get started on the project and pick your primary reference. Cars can be easy to paint if you just keep them simple. Again, go back to the safety idea of, is my car light? Is my car dark? And that's going to help you get a better shape on your car. So you can stack the shapes of your cars, such as parked cars, or keep them singular. Each one works just fine. You can also create some drama with paintings that are done indoors. And I created this bar scene it was just on an 8x10 panel, and I just had some fun with it. I set up in a bar with my friend, and we painted the lights and we painted the people serving drinks to customers. We had a lot of fun with that. And basically, what made this work was the collection of lights behind the figures and thinking of the figures as dark. So really, your reference could be as simple as that: dark figures and a lighter background. So just to summarize some of the ideas that we've looked at to extract drama and make an impact with your paintings, good ideas to maintain are going to help you out to organize your picture. And you can see the list here: good shapes, group or organize, relate everything to each other, edit, delete or suppress items, and maintain a good feeling. Have it be busy or calm or exciting, whatever you would like to portray. Be thinking of that feeling as you do your painting, and also maintaining that lot to a little idea. Things that are going to sabotage your painting are if you copy exactly the photo, if you keep things separated, remember always to merge stuff, if you render things separately, embellish or add detail. Outlining is going to be a sabotage to your painting. And if elements are too equal. So if you keep these two lists in mind, I think it's really going to help your paintings a lot. What we're after today in our paintings with drama is how to make an area of particular excitement where light is hitting either a shiny object or creating a flare effect. To create that visual interest, let's look at a couple of examples of understanding how light moves around an object. It's not just an area of light and an area of dark, whether it's going to be glasses on a cafe table or a car with headlights shining on a street. We want to have this idea of something glowing. Creating drama with lights is going to be pretty simple. We're going to look in the next segment at a couple of watercolor tips that really explain the idea of diffraction and halation, which are fancy terms for talking about light flaring around an object or creating a glow. A couple of photos here show examples of strong lighting conditions where the camera, in this case my iPhone, was able to capture the look that we're after. So the photos are going to help us understand some of the city elements and just elements of dazzle that are happening in our painting. I'm going to get out my watercolors now, and we're going to go through more simple exercises to understand those concepts of diffraction, halation, and just some basic simple shape making. Next, I'd like to talk to you a bit about how to start understanding color, how to set up a good value system and color structure to support dazzle in your paintings and to really maximize what you want to say. And it can be really well done with some simple watercolor notes here. And so we're going to go over that. You could do this in oil. It would be no problem at all. The reason I'm doing it in watercolor is it just seems to go a lot faster for me, and I like some of the connectivity of the way that the watercolor merges. And so that's why I'm choosing watercolor. Plus, as I mentioned before, I've painted watercolor street scenes for many years after living in Seattle, and it's become a really good way to kind of work out some color ideas and value notes for my future paintings. I'm just going to be working in some small areas here of this idea of collected lights in a nighttime setting. And an easy way to do that is either to do something like a sunset from memory, where you know that you have your brightest spot of the sun, or you can do a collection of lights. So let's say we have some city lights here, and those are going to be our brightest brights. We already know that. So the point of this exercise is basically to establish that your lights are your brightest bright, and a good way for me to try to tap into that is to work from memory. So this basic study was from a memory of walking along a pier at night, and I saw in the distance these bright lights reflected in the water. And to work from memory, all you have to do is remember, what was my brightest bright? Well, it was the lights. They were reflecting. And then, was there any ambient light in the night sky? And usually the answer is yes. And the mountain was darker. So that's the little study I'm going to create for you right now. So this is basically the water's edge. And the lights were not all yellow. I had some little areas of red. So the extra bonus of what is going to happen here, at least I'm hoping, is I'll have little leftover areas of white, and I want to have some connectivity with the watercolor, and it's all going to bleed together, but hopefully it'll teach us about water reflections too. So if that's my brightest bright, I need to get everything else a little bit darker. And so I can quite simply go around that. And you can go around some individual pieces as well. Try to vary the size. You can even chop some things up. What I remembered seeing was that the lights on the hillside were pretty small. So I just want to get all of this put in place. Let's chop that down too. There's a lot of light along the shore. And instead of being a test of my memory, I'm trying to think of the hierarchy of information. So as soon as I establish what is light and what is dark, and then challenge myself to break up these shapes in interesting ways, and guess what? This is going to help you become more abstract with your paintings. So it's a nice, fun exercise. Then we can even start suggesting some reflections here. Anything dark here is going to reflect like that. It's just a fun little thing to start understanding that idea of saving about, in the end, 10% of these lights. So the mountainside was in fact darker, and let's give that a bit of variety to it. So I'm just going to restate that. So I'm thinking about shape, variety. So these are all fairly similar. Let's divide that. Let's actually take some of these away. So also the good thing about this is that we're not, because we're working from memory, everything is simplified. My little brain can only retain so much information. But all that I'm thinking about is I have to maintain this area of light, and I want small bits of light, and that's going to lead me to some good shapes, I hope. And notice what else is happening. As I darken predominantly the rest of the page here, these lights appear to be getting brighter and brighter. So let's work a bit on my reflections, just to imply the waterfront here. And I want some of this soft. Reflections are always a little bit less bright. Soften some of those edges. So that's basically it. Just maintaining that hierarchy. And that blue is a little bit even. See what some darker areas in here are going to do. So this idea is going to repeat in our painting. We're going to be painting real things, but instead of this made-up scene, add what you need, subtract what is not necessarily important, and it's just going to help organize your artwork. So let's go a little bit bigger. Let's try to think about the lights that are happening on the street. If we have this type of light, let's do a couple of different lights here. They're equally spaced apart, and I might want to have some that are smaller. Now, these are just abstract little donut shapes right now. That's about it. So the point is, how do I make this yellow even brighter? How do I get this feeling of the flare of a light, maybe the sparkle on a rim of a glass if you're doing a still life? I want to set up, again, the hierarchy that these bright highlights, we can't go any brighter. This is the brightest bright. Same thing when you're working with oil. Your brightest bright is going to be titanium white or whatever white you happen to be using. And so the other thing that we can do to add variety just to these three little things is maybe we make a variety of color. So we're always after the idea of unity yet variety. So I'm trying to add some different colors here. And then a good supporting dark. Definitely make use of your color wheel where you have your opposites on your color wheel that are going to support the final message that you want to say with your painting. So the opposite of yellow is a purple type of color. I've dirtied the purple. And I can go right up next to that yellow. I'll just leave a part of this plain so that you could see how supporting with this darker shade, the value is darker, really makes a difference. You can even add a little echo of this color into the distance. So that would be another type of variety where that's a softer edge. And this idea of the colors kind of flowing together, I mean, this means nothing, but then again, this could be a collection of car headlights, right? And that's the fun thing about a city and even just that scatter of light. You really want that scatter to be irregular. You want to have different things happening. And sometimes it's nice to have really bright points. You can go around those areas of white. So understanding what watercolor does naturally and easily really helps me in crafting my oils so that they can get maximum impact by harnessing the power of what the light page can do for you, because watercolor handles light passages really well. So maybe even go darker. So that glow that's happening, I mean, that's basically what's going to be happening with the oils and making that impact. Let's just take a really quick look at a painting that shows some of that and some other studies that I've done. This is the same type of exercise where I've just added a different scatter of dots. And here we get into a bit more reality, but notice the percentage of light versus the percentage of dark is definitely weighted on the dark side. And the darks are predominant, so the light is really called out and tends to sparkle. Here is just a very simplified form of that. I'm trying out some browns here, and I went back to just gold and just neutral colors. So these would be great, you can think of these as color dot studies for your future art. I think that would work out great. Or you could just do those simple pencil studies and move right into the final. Here's an example of a painting that incorporates that scattered light dot idea. You can see the flare that's happening here. This is Atlanta Rush. And we've got some scattering of red dots here and a halo happening, and a lot of the lights are connected. I have photos that show things getting dissolved in light. Strong light, especially in a night city scene, will appear to wrap around an object. And also, if you've ever seen a TV on in a dark room, you realize it's casting a glow. So that idea of light emanating from something or light wrapping around something, those ideas of what is happening to the light rays, that's called diffraction or halation. Halation is when we get this kind of halo around the hot spot of the light. Based on your color wheel, we've already done it to some degree here, but yellow and purple are opposites on the color wheel, so that's what this study represents. And so in order for yellow, which in fact on all of this white paper, it looks a little pathetic. It doesn't look like it's very peppy at all. So we need to help the yellow to kind of be shouty. And in order to do that, the Impressionists would do different things. They played around with value, which I'll show you in a minute. But also they did something where they would put the same value, they would take this value and they would put the complement adjacent to it. If you look at this in black and white, both of these colors existing should be pretty close to the same value. Purple's a really strong color and yellow's very pale, so I just want to get rid of this little bump there. So this is called a color bounce idea, or it's really what Impressionism is. And if you take away the value here, this is a very subtle way of extracting maximum color on a really brilliant, brightly lit day. So even though this video that we're making is about strong lighting and getting drama in your paintings and making them sparkle, I think it's good to mention that a really bright painting could also be a painting about strong sunlight, or maybe a white boat with the glittering sea beyond, and how are you going to make that really spark and hit the viewer's eye and make them feel like sun is reaching out and grabbing them. You're going to want to make use of some of these ideas. So I've created a painting in oil that was done for a painting competition, and I wanted to create that feeling of very strong sunlight. And I think that that has that sparkly feeling, but it's all in the very light key. And I was really working with these pastel colors coexisting right next to each other. So that's another way to create drama with just adjacent colors instead of going all the way to super strong value. Here's an example that I prepared for you. You can certainly make this chart yourself, and I highly encourage you to do that. A pet peeve of mine is when in a workshop somebody makes me paint squares. I like to do that on my own time. Anyway, so that we can get painting, let's just examine some of these components of these squares and what they're going to do for drama in your painting. I know it's hard to look away from all of this high contrast with the value. So if I cover these areas of dark and we're just looking at these light areas, let's explore what's happening so far. We've got yellow, red, green, and blue, and this is pretty much as bright as I can make it with my watercolor. So how are we going to help that color to be shouty? How are we going to help that to have a lot of pizzazz? Well, there's a couple of tricks that we have, and depending on what you want to say in your painting, this is how we're going to do it. This is the typical way, which is maybe not enough contrast, and especially for watercolor. This is unfortunately where Watercolor has the bad reputation of not getting strong and punchy enough. So watercolor sometimes has trouble going dark enough. So I've just given an example here of these, I would say, are soft transitions, and it's not that these are bad, but they just don't have any drama at all. And that is because I've shifted the value a little bit darker. So it's certainly better than, all of these are reading as dark against the white. But if we look at these, we have a little bit more contrast, but really not that much. And we're not making use of the complementary colors. For example, red is, if we put a red type of and by the way, this and this are the same color. Optically, they don't look like that. It looks like this is lighter, but they're the same color. By giving it a box of a little bit darker color, it optically makes it look a little brighter. So we're getting a little brighter, but if we're trying to create a neon sign, it's pretty far off the mark. Going back to the complement idea, this red, by giving it an orangey brown, yes, it's a duller color, yes, it's darker in value, but it's just not creating that snap or that pop that we want. And even if we go dark enough, it is just not going to have that punch that we're looking for. Here's that complement idea, just in a box form. So you could see the color looks a little bit more peppy. Here I do have a tiny bit of a color shift. It got a little darker here, I would say. And in this box, we can see the full-on complement, and wow, this is just like, these are all just jumping off of the page. And so purple complement for yellow, green complement for red, et cetera, et cetera. And by giving the complement and having a full-blown dark, and you could even probably go a shade darker if you wanted to, you really get that pop of color. However, for the biggest pop of color, what is going to be the best is to maybe leave a little chip of white and give a full, almost a pasty look of just a rim of color before you switch. So this is getting back to that halo idea, and how can we maximize the look of the halo. So we have background color contrast in small amounts, muted color, but really dark. So I don't mean to like rush ahead. All of a sudden we had color cubes, and how can we make them bright? The answer is incorporate elements of the complement, go really dark for your background, and then give this rim highlight, very intense, of your chosen color. And for added impact, you could even add a little bit of white. So in oil, that's going to be easy. In watercolor, we'd have to lift out. So let's maybe look at some simplified ways of looking at perspective. Let's go back to our Riviera lights here. Whenever you're confronted with small details, whether this is for landscape painting or for following through with creating some drama and sparkle in your own paintings, you want to maintain this idea. We're going to talk about two things. One is organic scatter marks, and marks that are good for the painting and have visual interest, which we kind of covered here. And also I'm going to be talking about shapes and then how to break up those shapes, because these components are going to be key for abstracting our urban landscape. Let's work in a red since we're going to be dealing with light. So if you're trying to create lights, and I know these are dark against the light page, but I think you get the point. No matter how hard you try with the brush and have good intentions, I'm trying to create an irregular pattern, there's still a little bit of polka dotness that is going to come into play. So you always have to watch out for that. One thing I really like about watercolor is quite simply by splattering, you already get a more organic look to whatever you're doing. And whether it's with some big dots or the little dots, it's just already more organic. Plus, watercolor actually hooks some things together, And in fact, because we have such a heavy bead of water within the dots themselves, we're getting more micro variation. This is a lot like what happens to nature for tree leaves, even glitter on pavement, or in the case of man-made city lights, you're still going to get that happening because it's in the natural world, and even though there's some type of order, creating some of this, let's call it maybe organized chaos, because we don't want chaos in the form of polka dot and fracturing everything, but we want these drifts or sprinkles of interest. There's that idea. Let's just take that away for a minute. So the other thing is the implied line for shapes, and we're going to talk about buildings, figures, and cars. So those components are kind of important for putting in your city scene. If you don't have them in, it's going to have, at the worst, an apocalyptic feel, or at the best, just kind of a lonely, what happened on this city street? How come it's not filled with life? So let's look at the simplest way of creating buildings, which is going to be quite simply some varied cubes. So let's say I'm on a boat and I'm looking at the New York skyline, right? So here's my water's edge. Okay, we know the buildings are tall, and we want to vary them. So if I'm just working with cubes, this is the easiest way to work with buildings, which is silhouette. So this building is already equal to this building, and the space in between is just about equal too. So what if this one just got a little bit fatter? Already it's a more interesting silhouette. And maybe this one is skinnier and goes down more. And maybe this has a little tower on the top or a little something. So you can create visual interest. Maybe this is multi-level. Maybe this is extra tall. So you can create some visual interest just with very simple, and this doesn't require any perspective whatsoever. You could quite simply be working with a city skyline, and instead of an organic mountain shape, you could create a skyline like this and do some studies that way. So perspective doesn't have to be, a deal breaker for doing some city scenes. And as soon as we have a shape like this, if we're talking about having things be visually interesting, all of these edges are very hard and sharp. So if we break some of these edges, and these dissolve marks don't really mean anything. I'm just kind of creating some random patterns here. I think already we have a more interesting scene because we have micro shifts in color that have happened, and the regularity of the silhouette has been modified to have basically abstraction on top. So we have a lot of fat shapes here, so if you introduce some thin lines, all of a sudden the thin lines are going to hold a lot of impact. So this is going to hold the viewer's attention because you've created some thin lines. So this is just balancing a lot of square city shapes with maybe a couple of thin filigree lines somewhere. So this, the scatter, all of the cityscape stuff, these are all ways to kind of encourage the viewer to believe that more is going on, more texture is going on, more detail is going on, but really you don't have to put as much detail in. So I think that's the good news. Let's take a look at figures, which most people say, no thank you, I would rather not put figures in my painting. And I think that's just because if you have one, there's a lot of weight resting on that one figure. especially in the context of a landscape. It's why I like to do city scenes, because if you have many buildings, it's going to be easier than if you have one building. I think doing one building in the landscape can be a challenge. There's a lot resting on that one building. You've got to have, let's say the porch angle's just perfect, or the roof line has to be just so. Well, if you have a lot of shapes in your city and you're going to vary some of that information, and you're thinking about a tapestry of scatter dots, color shift, interesting shapes, if you approach it that way, then in fact what is going to be starting to happen is you're entering a little bit more into abstraction and visual entertainment for the viewer. So we're going to notice less what are these roof lines when you have a cityscape, because there's more buildings. Okay, so if I'm thinking about a figure, the simplest way to be thinking about figures is have multiples and have them be smaller. If you have a really big figure, you'll probably have to spend a little bit more time working on them. And a really great way to be thinking about figures is we've got head, torso, and then it's the rare person that stands with a very wide stance. In photos, you can see frozen moments where somebody might have a leg out. So the shoulders happen here. Don't do arms just quite yet, and you can have your figure, instead of two legs like this is where people get into trouble or try to do feet. Let's just simplify that. Just taper that, and then just do a suggestion of arms or the body, and just keep everything close together. And I'm also thinking of groupings of figures, and is my figure light or is my figure dark? Usually in a nighttime situation, they're going to be dark. And heads are pretty much the same, but here's maybe a woman and a man's going to be a little bit taller. Be careful the head isn't too big. I'll just make the head too big on purpose here. They're walking, they're having a good time. They just finished some shopping. Maybe you'll have a little shadow here. So if the head is too big, just kind of restate that. Make the head smaller than you think. And that's going to work out better. It's watercolor, it's making a halo now. Let's see if we could get that. Take away the water so it doesn't spread. There we go. And maybe he's got like a jacket on. You could restate some of your darks. They're buds. Maybe a shopping bag. These are just like little ways to suggest, activity in the city. Let's have a larger figure and show the idea of, if you want to add just a little bit of color in that, you can start with a mid gray. And just by adding like a dark red or something like that to the jacket area, that's going to be helpful. So watch what happens if you give your figure a really dark background, especially of the wrong color. I mean, sometimes you can get away with this area. This would be linking your shapes, but you don't want to you want your figure to be called out somehow. We're back to the silhouette idea. You can break up your silhouette in some fashion, but you don't want to dissolve too much of your figure, because then, if let's say your dark area comes in here, then you've just beheaded your figure. So in city scenes, you have to pay attention to little things like this, you know, I would either change that value back, just micro shifts, it doesn't have to be a big deal, and then maybe restate that. So, I mean, these are just easy ways to incorporate a figure. This would be as if somebody was sitting on a bench, because then the seated view has you looking up at people. Imagine sitting on a park bench, somebody comes up to you, you say, oh, hey, how's it going? Right? Because you're looking up at them. So really remember, you want all of your heads pretty much to be on the same level. If you see seated figures, those heads are going to be at a lower level. Just check out any photo of a cafe and you'll see all of the heads are going to line up for the seated folks, and heads of walking people will be at a higher level, or the head of the waiter is going to be at a higher level. So your figures can be light or your figures can be dark. Most of the time they're going to be dark. That's what we talked about. Cars are another matter. Cars can be light or they can be dark, or they can be both. So make your life simple. Choose what type of car you want to paint and what is going to work with your design. And let's examine just some simple, you can think of these as like icons for cars. Just by keeping the car as a little bit more of a boxy shape to begin with. I'm doing a car from behind, and the wheels actually sit here. Usually there's a bit of variety. There's gonna be a line where that is. And you just want to have just a little hint of the window there. Maybe it's catching the light. Maybe that's dark too. And if you have multiple cars, they're going to be stacked like this, and then they're possibly going to go back. Sometimes you can get away with some dashed lines and just start to have things like that for your cars, and sometimes their roof line lines up. Sometimes what you've done here undermines what you did there, and so you can just simplify some of this or reduce your value. See what works for you, but you certainly don't have to draw out every single car and make your supporting area work for what you want to say for your car. That's the way to handle those. The simplest way is to use this either coming towards you with some headlights, then either maybe reflected, or some tail lights, or you can have a car that you're looking at straight on, and you can just practice those. Again, if you have more than one, it's going to be in your best interest, because then the viewer isn't going to look at, oh, there's the one that was painted. So have multiples, and that will serve you well. Another way to start understanding perspective, if your painting is going to be happening here, as in the simple sketch that I showed you before, is just look for what the sky shape is. So I'll just make a sky shape here. When I was walking the streets of Paris with my students, a lot of them were very worried about painting all those crazy buildings in perspective. And what I realized was, because the streets were so narrow, I had everybody walking around looking at the sky with either a V or a U type of symbol. And you could really fit most of the skyline in place by looking at this V, which if you look at this V, it's going to give you the exaggerated angles that you need for correct buildings. Usually they fall right into place if you have this type of V shape built in. And this V shape will in fact lead you to where your street line is going to need to be. And then you can put in your buildings, and then you've found your street. Windows going in perspective don't have to be overthought. They could just be suggested as closer to the viewer and larger, and then going back and becoming much smaller. So this is just a really great way to start simplifying some complicated, maybe European scenes that you have. That way, when you look at your city scenes, you can start looking for those V shapes, or the peace out V shape, or the U shape. And I think that's better than worrying about vanishing point and perspective and lines and so forth. Certainly a course or a good book or video on perspective is going to help you, but just this simple, easy idea is going to get you on track for discovering some good shapes, and that's what we're all about today. Now we're going to set out our materials on the palette, and I'm going to walk you through what colors I use and why I put them there on my palette. Just in general, I'm going to have my oil paints set up. I have a few ways that I draw with the paint on the canvas and a collection of brushes here. We can even start with the brushes. I've got some hog hair bristle brushes of varied sizes. I even have this brush, which it's kind of like a mural brush. It's made of natural bristles, and you could probably find something similar to this in the hardware store if you wanted to. You don't necessarily need an artist brush. These are my favorite brushes, and I like a more stiff or resistant flex to the brush. And these are synthetic. They're made for oil, not to be confused with the ones that are made for acrylic. Those are a little softer. So these are oil brushes. These happen to be rosemary and silver Bristolon. They're going to range in size from about 2 to maybe 8. Notice this one is a little larger. Sometimes I like in the larger sizes to work with the hog hair, or I guess they're called different things, China boar bristle, but basically I think of these as natural hair or bristle brushes. Over time, your brushes are going to have a stained look to them. They should still come to a chiseled point. There are times when I will make use of an old tired brush. Over time, these brushes end up opening up, and they still have use maybe as like a fan brush, but pretty much I want a sharp-edged tool to work with. Speaking of sharp edges, I have my palette knife. I'm going to have maybe some different knives. This happens to be my favorite shape, especially for painting city scenes. It has a nice point and it has a really good edge to it. Some knives are curved, and I think this is a good size. When you're using a knife, you really want a good flexible tip to it. There are some knives that don't have that. And I'm very particular as well in the fact that I don't like for this area to peel off. So if you spend a bit more money, you're going to get a good quality knife. I may or may not use this. It's a squeegee. It was from an auto detailing set. I have like 10 other pieces that came with it at home. You can pick up a kit like that for about $20 just online. And lastly, let's talk about my solvents that I'm using. I don't use solvent. I'm going to be using walnut oil, Terpenoid Natural if I need to clean my brushes at any point. And then I have water in this container. So let's get things set up. I'm going to put things out in a kind of square, which mimics what I have for my paint box. When I have the luxury of a larger space to work on, I like to put out ample amounts of white. So often I have a mixing white and a pure white. This is titanium white. I really need my cadmium yellow, so I brought a few duplicates, just in case the tube of paint got crimped and it was unusable. Same with white. White is so important. I usually travel with 2 tubes of white, even if one is very small, and I need ample amounts of white, and I might actually have one of them in my bag if I'm doing some plein air studies. Just always keep this in my bag. So all of the tube paint that you can buy today is ready to go. You don't really need any additives to make it work. It's ready to go right from the tube. And there's two different types of paint. There's artist grade and then there's student grade. Of course, that's going to depend on your budget, but you do get what you pay for. It's not just a marketing ploy. There's actually more pigment, more grains of the coloration that goes into the components of what makes our tube of paint. It's more packed with power. You can think of it that way. And the student paint has filler in it. But for just experimentation, or maybe it's your first time painting, that would be fine to be using student grade pigment. And you can read all of that information on the label of paint. It will tell you what type of paint it is. I'm using a paper towel just to help open up these caps if they get a little sticky. Over time, there might be some gook around the edges of your paint. And especially it seems like the older the paint gets, the more junk is there. I want to show you, this sounds like a crazy thing, but it's, I think, very important. When you open up your tube of paint, try not to squeeze it here. You actually want to hold it on the shoulders if you can, over on this side. And the reason for that is this is going to push paint into the cap. So you want to hold it like around here. And notice I do fold up the ends as the paint gets used. That avoids the big twisted tube of paint. So when I open this up, as I squeeze out the paint, I want my level of paint to be here. I don't want to put this away with it poking out of the top. And when I squeeze out the bubble of paint, I put it out like this and then I clean that off. So again, if it's going to be like this, it's just going to create a mess and possibly be glued shut next time you try to open it. So if you want to, you squeeze here to get the paint out, and then to make the paint go back in, you can just relax that and it should go back in. Sometimes you can get it to go back in pretty well with just squeezing here. That actually works with watercolor too. Just a touch of phthalo blue. Notice how I put out much less of that. That goes a long way. Very high tinting strength for that. Here you can see a little bit of the twisted tube look, so before I put this away, I'm just going to squeeze this up. In the studio, I have a tube wringer, which is why this looks crimped. It does save you money with your paint. They cost about 20 bucks. Over time, it'll pay for itself. We have all of our paint now. All right, let's take a look at what we've got. So these are the water mixables, and going back to the traditional paints, and yes, they can all intermix together, but it'll make more sense when I actually get started, and you'll see me do water mixable start. Then I'm going to move right to just a la prima painting or full-on painting, however you would like to say it, all at once, and just using the traditional oils. Okay, so titanium white. This is Gamblin solvent-free gel, which has an alkyd base to it. It has some oil, some resin, and it just helps the color spread sometimes. I might add a touch of my walnut oil, which is in the no-lid container. Cobalt blue, French ultramarine, phthalo blue. For night scenes, Prussian blue might also be a good color choice, but I chose not to bring it. Sometimes I can just add the tiniest bit of phthalo blue to add some real hotness or vivid color to the sky. So we've got cobalt teal here and cad yellow light, cad yellow. The cad yellow family is very wide. They've got cad deep, this, that, then there's cadmium hue. So when you see the word cadmium hue, it means it doesn't have any cadmium in the paint tube. And cadmium and cobalt, we have to treat those pigments with respect. It just means you don't want to eat while using those. You should dispose of your paint rags properly. And they have small amounts of a toxic substance, which is what makes up the paint. But they're beautiful paints. That's why they're still around. And if they're used properly, they're safe. So I just make sure that I don't have any cuts on my fingers or hangnails or things like that. And then those pieces of paint, the particles, won't migrate into your skin. Your skin is enough of a barrier. You won't need to wear gloves. So moving on, this is a color called Azo Coral. The equivalent color for some other manufacturers, the pigment is kind of the same, but they might have a different name for it. Sometimes names vary between brands. This happens to be M. Graham. And they make this color as a cadmium red substitute. And I think it performs really well. Equivalents in other brands are going to be permanent red light, perhaps, or Pyrrole red is another name that I've seen that under. Interestingly enough, you can go on the manufacturer's site or you can look at the tube of paint and you can see that there's a numerical value that tells you what the pigment is that is inside your tube of paint if you're not sure. So this is a quinacridone red and this is anthraquinone red. They're very similar. It's a synthetic red that for a long time, paint manufacturers were not able to get a permanent dark burgundy wine type of color red. So if you see original alizarin crimson, it's not necessarily a color you want to have on your palette because it's considered not light fast. And also paint tubes will inform you if your color is light fast or not. And light fast simply means, will this fade over time? And unfortunately, in the case of alizarin crimson, the answer is most definitely yes, this will fade over time. And that could be in a short amount of time. For example, if you're using thin amounts of this in watercolor or oil, it will fade in as little as maybe a year or two. Museums that have Winslow Homer watercolors exhibit the watercolors sparingly because they want to preserve the amount of light that falls on the paintings. And if you remove the matte from the watercolors, you can see, oh my gosh, the scene of a man in the boat used to be a sunset scene, but it's not anymore. Anyway, there's a lot of I don't mean to skip over that because it's important, and you can find tons of information about that in books or online and just read up on knowing about your pigments. So then we have, this is also water mixable. It's rather equivalent in color. This is interesting because these have different properties, but technically they're the same alizarin crimson substitute. And so it just shows you that even though the name might be the same, a different brand, in fact, will possibly look different when you squeeze it out, but the paint number is the same. That's very confusing, but it does happen. And then we have this transparent oxide, and again, transparent oxide in the water mixable. And these look and behave very similar. So this is an example of same name, same numerical value, different manufacturer, pretty equal. And I just have this one down because it's water mixable and I like it to start. So there you have all the materials we're going to use to make our artwork today. In preparation for today's artwork, I decided, am I going to do horizontal or vertical? And I just did some really simple studies that took a minute or two. And I wanted to decide which one was going to be better. I ended up choosing this one. And why did I not pick this one? I actually think that would have worked out fine. I just really liked this nice U shape here. It had some irregular edges. I felt like I could get the viewer to move around. So basically I was looking at a shape like this. Or is it going to be a shape more like this? And you can see that this one has a bit more irregularity to it. And I also felt like the V aspect of this had the viewer exiting the picture frame a bit more and started to look a bit too much like an X, so that's why I decided to go with this one. So the simple exercises in watercolor and also just drawing out a few simple ideas are going to really play a large part of how I start this painting. So to start, I've got my water. And I want to get kind of a soupy mixture. Think of this as like milk. So this is just water I'm pulling out here with my French ultramarine and my transparent oxide. And I'm looking for that all-important, interesting sky shape that we worked on. Here's the halfway point for transferring my scene. I can also mark that on my study if I feel like I need to. This notched shape and where the figure comes in is going to be important. And even though these street lines are not essential at this point, it's just another way to start understanding where things are going to be happening on the painting. And I want to get this car in place. These are just really rough, bubble kind of organic shapes about how things are and my pattern of light and dark. This panel that I'm working on is Centurion linen. It's on a cardboard back. There's a slipperiness to the finish. I'm really not sure why this is happening. I have not experienced this before. It's beating up as if there was something weird on the surface. It should still perform the same way. Sometimes what happens is there's like almost a hard finish from maybe the wrapping that was on there or something like that. So by rubbing off, it's already taking the paint a little bit better. So always a surprise in the realm of art. When I used to paint in watercolor, there was this one time when I actually had paper that they must have forgotten to size. And so I opened a new package of paper and there was something wrong with it. So every now and again, manufacturers mess up and the supplies aren't what you think. So I guess a tip for this moment in time is have extra panels on hand just in case. Which I do. I have extra panels, but I think this one will be fine. So here's the dark car. Notice that I'm crafting the shape of the sky. I'm thinking about that notched edge and how that is going to be visually of interest. This is exiting the picture plane here. This one is exiting it here. This is exiting the picture plane here. So these are elements that we worked out and just looking at some of the shapes that can happen. I want to switch this, so I just take a bit of water. You can even get a clean brush if you want to. Sometimes I think about this as my drawing brush and then the eraser brush. So you can see you can get back to almost the canvas as it was. Let's get some stuff going on here. This is the block in, so really want to get stuff blocked in. One reason that I like my synthetic brushes is they don't get floppy when I put them in water. So this being a natural hair brush, I know is going to get floppy. If I really dipped this in water, it's going to get really soft. But for now, it's doing just fine. And I just want to tone that sky. I might even add a little bit of this Theo Violet. Just really want to get that blocked in, just to know where things are. And there's a touch of water with that too. So notice I'm really avoiding where this lamp is. And that's on purpose because I want to preserve that white. Those of you who have painted in watercolor know that this is starting out very similar to a watercolor. Let me just wreck up this line a little bit. And all of this is going to be dark, so I can just continue the toning of this. And I have this idea to increase the halo quality. I want to have a ribbon, that ribbon of light coming through. And my figure should really, I don't want it to merge into the lamppost, but the figure is going to be happening here somewhere, so I just want a really blocky shape for that. And here's that idea of the U, and then we're going to create the other one, which in fact, this, in the very beginning, this was kind of looking a little bit dark because I had marks on there, but with the toning, this is starting to already glow, and we're getting that ribbon of light feeling. You don't need a big brush to do this step, but it's nice, especially these big brushes are useful when you're working larger as well. And sometimes you can really say a lot with the big brush and just get it done fairly quickly, which is always a bonus. So this area with the focal point being somewhere in here, and that idea of the fan that we talked about before on how to handle those city shapes and not freak out about perspective. And the fan here, and also the V or the U for the sky. So those ideas help me so much, even just in the blocking in stage. So for planning, for blocking in, for looking for the interlocking, interesting shape that we have. And despite all of your planning, you might have a moment where you think, okay, is my design still saying what I want it to say? Right now, I would say no, but remember the idea of we have dark things, we have mid-value things, and we have light things. And then we also have the idea of lot to a little. So the idea for lot to a little is I really don't want to have so much white stuff, even though the temptation might be I want pizzazz, I want sparkle, I want to dazzle the viewer. We have to set up a hierarchy. You have to only have, to create the maximum impact, you have to be thinking of maybe 5 to 10%, 10% maximum of highlights. That is difficult. That's really difficult, because if we want to have that zesty moment in the painting, you have to think about those small bits, and I'm building this whole thing to support the small pieces that are going to go on later, the sparkle. Let's do some good planning. Let's continue to kill parts of the white. And what we're going to do is set up the idea of continuing to link these shapes so that then I have the white shapes that become linked, those blobby things. So really I could merge these cars, and my blurry sketch helps me a lot. This building could be suppressed in importance. And so now I have sky merging with building, merging with cars. So already we have less white showing. So this is everything, really. This is design, this is movement of perspective, this is linking of shapes, and by linking these dark shapes, we're starting to find out a little bit more about those lighter shades. You could still really be thinking of this as I have dark stuff and I have light stuff, and where do I want the importance to be? Okay, let's keep going with some of these things here. I've got this U of light, the area is working. So I want to have this dark awning. Let's double check where that is. If I think the figure's head is here, do I want to have, is the awning right there next to the head? I might want to move that up just a little. The shop front here. Oh, it might be too far over. Eraser brush. I'll bring this back just a little bit. I really love these lights in here, they're great. So this area is lighter, but it's not as light as what is happening here. So the points of zing are going to be, I've got here, here, and here. It could change as the painting develops, but I don't want to stray from it too radically. And I have a leftover oddball shape here. Whoopsie. Often I skip around because I don't want to develop this contour exactly. I want to keep these suggestive kind of amoeba shapes happening, because in crafting my painting this way, I'm using full on the power of suggestion for creating these shapes. Notice there's no hard edges yet whatsoever, with the exception of this, which is incorrect. Let's just wreck that up to make a point here. So I think, getting out the ruler and things like that, I think that's a little bit overrated. Now, bear in mind, this is how I like to work. I like to work with these bubble, kind of cloud, organic type of shapes. For somebody else, there might be comfort in knowing exactly where your lines are. However, I think that the reason that I like to work this way is not only for that power of suggestion being on your side, but I feel like I could really change shapes, and this leaves me to have a sharp edge as almost a detail point. So a sharp edge is going to command attention, it's going to draw the viewer's eye, and just like we were talking about before with that lot to a little idea, we really only want to have a certain amount of sharp edges. We don't want to go crazy with the sharp edges. We want to have variety. Let's see here. Always when creating my painting, I'm thinking about this idea of unity yet variety. And so that is how to tame some of the chaos that we see. The picture reference is just loaded with detail. And so what do we take out? So you've probably heard the saying that the hardest decision is what to leave out of your painting. And I would say that that is certainly true. That's what we worked on our exercises for. Just strengthening some of the dark that's happening up here. So let's talk about the paint film that is starting to develop. It might be tempting, even though it's not very beautiful yet. Hopefully this will get to a stage when you could almost be interested in perhaps leaving this for the sky. But this area is really so thin, it just won't stand the test of time. It's going to be easy to scratch that out even after it fully dries. We have to protect the integrity of the paint film. And building the paint film is going to go for that idea of fat over lean. So I'm starting with lean layers, meaning that they're thin and they don't contain much oil. And when we go to thicker layers, those will adhere to the canvas. Everything will merge together and be what is considered archival. So this is not considered archival because it has such a thin paint layer on it. So you might argue, well, watercolorists do that and acrylic painters do that. They do, but watercolor is protected under glass. It's usually on paper too. And if you would do an acrylic painting this thin, I would think that some artists might want to put medium on top of that or some other protector to just protect this delicate paint film, because the thinner it is, the more delicate it's going to be. Often I'll just use this transparent oxide and the blue to create a mixed setup for my painting. This is still a little bit unresolved here. Let me just zap that down. It's a little bossy. This is a foreshadowing of what the painting will be. Let's look at it that way. I don't like this shape. This shape and that shape are repeating. Let's kill the top of this building. In other words, the blockiness that was here, that cube really repeated there. And I'm going to extend this building. I'm looking at how this building relates to the dark car here, and I don't want to have those elements stacked. So the building was ending here, and then the car started there. But if I extend this out, and maybe even have a secondary building here, what's creating the wipeout ability is the moisture in the brush. And I don't need to get back to the white of the canvas because now I'm starting to set up the hierarchy of my dark stuff, my medium stuff, and finally those last bits of light. So ideally, what I want to have happen is to be putting my super lights onto basically the naked white of the panel. And that's just going to create the maximum kind of bang for your buck as far as having the color jump off of the page or the canvas support. And we're engaging the idea of a type of stained glass look or watercolor, because still a little portion of the paint, by residing on the surface of the white, that's just how you get your brightest color. So I'd like to also say that we're dealing with a surface here, and by piling on a highlight, wouldn't that be sufficient? And also, hey Christine, what about the fact that the white and the yellow are opaque paints? So opaque usually means that it can cover over everything. So does it seem silly to be going around all of these shapes and doing all of this? Why didn't I just block in everything and have it be dark? You could have that type of argument if you wanted to, and there are a lot of good artists who work that way. One of the ways that I have decided to create all of my paintings is based on this idea of these watercolor chips and using some of the transparency that is available. So I think that makes them unique in a certain regard. Artists through the centuries have used some of those ideas, working on a light surface and not toning the canvas. It's another reason I don't tone my canvas. So those are a lot of ideas I just tossed out here about why I'm working this way, and also maybe addressing the fact that you perhaps have seen somebody start a night painting or a drama type of painting a different way. So this is what works for me. And also I like to get excited about these white shapes that are left. I don't want to see any underpainting there at all.
Brushstrokes. Loose, rich brushstrokes give a painting life. Abstract shapes. Loosely rendered scenery. Colorful passages. Soft edges. Bright reflections. It's the language of painting, and once you discover how to paint loosely and with feeling, you'll experience newfound freedom and growth as an artist. If you're looking for something new and fresh to challenge you, look no further than Christine Lashley. We learned about her from artist Scott Christensen, who told us she was one of the artists he was watching and impressed with because of her unique command of painting. Just look at these paintings. To capture a scene with such delicate beauty requires a light touch and an understanding of how to place all the elements together perfectly, a skill very few have ever mastered. Now Christine will show you exactly how to create the energy, movement, glimmer, and drama that brings any scene to life, whether bright daylight, moody fog, or a nighttime scene.
It's really where I learned about the power of how to create light and get the vibrancy in your paintings.
From the initial concepts of how to capture light and reflections, to simple tips for painting figures in proper perspective. Christine guides you step by step through a complete painting with attention to color, temperature, and value for added dramatic effects.
And maybe this is going to be a better start to the mixture, and then slicing this off like a piece of cake here.
Christine Lashley is not only known as one of the top painters on the scene today, she is a masterful instructor who has received national recognition and awards for her tremendous ability to paint light, and believing no subject is too hard for any skill level artist to paint. Christine breaks up the steps so you can practice right along with her.
Easy thing that you can do to prepare for painting that you're going to create is go out, experience the scene, maybe make a quick memory study, and I'll show you a little bit about that later.
Soon, you'll have a better understanding of the techniques it takes to use color and value for maximum impact, to paint with a more dramatic flair, and how using looser brushstrokes will allow you to be more expressive and make your paintings sparkle. Incorporate Christine's methods to infuse your paintings with vibrant energy and life. Paintings that Sparkle with Christine Lashley. Available on DVD and digital to view on your computer, tablet, or smartphone. Order yours today.
You know, Christine really does make paintings that sparkle. There's some life in her paintings, and she teaches you how to do that, which is pretty cool. You can learn more about her video at lilyartvideo.com. Now let's speak to Christine and find out more about her. Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes with Plein Air Magazine, and welcome to Interviews with the Artist. Today we have Christine Lashley. Christine, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I am so excited. You're such a rock star painter. You're doing such beautiful work that it's like your career's on fire. I'm sure you're an overnight success, right? How long have you been doing this?
Well, I feel like I've been painting for a long time, but I've just really taken it seriously for, I'd say, the past 6 to 7 years. And
That's impressive.
Thank you. I just kind of, the kids are getting older, and I thought, what am I waiting for? I have to put myself out there. I have to be risky. I have to enter plein air events. Why not?
So when did the painting begin for you?
Really, things started taking off, like I said, when I entered plein air events. Plein Air Vermont, which doesn't exist anymore, was the first one that I did.
And that's why you did it, and they killed it.
Well, I did get an award, yes.
It can't get any better than this.
It's just, well, first of all, the people that I met there were so nice, and they were people I'd read about in the magazine. I just remember being in the break room, and I'm like, oh, you're Jason Sacron. I know you from the magazine. And
Let me touch your robe.
I know, and he was like, stop, and we just chatted like normal people would, like we are. And it was great. Everybody was so nice. They shared tips. And that was it. I was hooked from then on.
But that's when you decided to apply yourself and really get aggressive about it. So
Yes.
when was the first time you picked up a paintbrush or had interest in art?
Really early on.
Like-
I mean, I've just always been painting, but I never really knew what to do with it. I mean, I went to art school, and you think that they would teach you, and they do. You learn the fundamentals, but then how do you make a career out of it? And I think what we're talking about is, what do you want to visually say? What is it that really excites you? What do you want to paint more than anything else? Mm-hmm. And how do you want to say it? And if it's not getting the recognition it deserves, or if you're not getting into contests, what can you do to better yourself, to really make yourself stand out, to be better?
So where did you go to art school?
I went to Washington University in St. Louis. They have a great art program.
Okay. And so, but it didn't give you the complete picture. So
Correct.
You're missing the art business side, and they were teaching you technology, but not feeling. You talked
Well,
about.
you flatter me. It was on the cusp of, computers were entering the graphic design art market, and people were like, I don't know about that.
Mm-hmm. So you entered school. You went to school. You studied. Were you intending this as a career, or was it just something to fill time?
I never thought that I could make it as a painter, so to speak, because who makes it as a painter? So I was thinking graphic design, murals, illustration. So I, in fact, have an illustration degree. And we had great figure drawing, and we did get a great education in that school. But it's a broad education.
I think Dean Mitchell went to that school, didn't he? I think so, St. Louis.
Oh, yeah, that sounds familiar. Donna Karan. I mean, a lot of good artists have been there. And in fact, I took fashion classes. It was great to have a sampling of everything.
Did Donna copy your ideas?
Wearing black, yes.
Yeah. And so you get out of school. What happens then?
So I worked graphic design and doing murals. And at a certain point, I just kind of, I don't know, I thought, I just don't want to be a graphic designer anymore. I want to do something else. And then I decided to stay at home and have kids.
That'll change everything.
Right, and it did. In fact, my kids were a turning point in my career because I stayed at home with them. I made a commitment to be happy with what I had, which was a beautiful home life, wonderful children. And I started teaching lessons in the evening and started doing children's portraits because all of a sudden people were interesting. My kids were so perfect.
Of course.
And their friends started, we'd have play dates and, hey, who did the art here? Wow, those paintings of kids are cute. Can you paint my kids? And so then I started teaching lessons and doing children's portraits in watercolor.
And what age were your kids at this time? They're pretty young.
Yeah, let's see, infant to toddlers, and then they entered school, and I started teaching a little bit more.
So you're painting, you're making a little bit of money on the side kind of thing, or are you making a lot of money?
Yeah, it was a little bit here and there. Plus, it was a chance to be an adult again. Dad's going to put the kids to bed and read them a story, and Mom's going to go teach her art class. Yay!
Yay, you get to get out of the house.
Mom's big night out.
Yeah, right. And so at what point then did you decide to pursue this on a more serious level? Was it once the kids got to the point where they're in school all day? Was it a point where they're grown?
Well, they had to be a little more self-sufficient, and I'm very fortunate in that I have, they started cooking for themselves, first just peanut butter and jelly. Don't worry, Mom, we'll be fine for an hour. And then when I can finally do the plein air events when they were old enough, if they were at home, they could let themselves into the house after school, maybe even make a simple dinner. At first it was, don't turn on the stove.
Yeah.
You can reheat what's in the fridge.
Can they do that now?
Yes, they're great. Yes, my kids are definitely old enough to do that.
So when you talk about doing plein air events and you got kids at home, most of these events you're going off for a few days. Were you able to do that, or were you just kind of going out to something that happened to be on a weekend day? Or?
Well, it was a tough transition for the family. They were, on the one hand, very supportive, but sometimes I would get into an event, I got in, I can't believe isn't that great? And the word was, oh, that's great, Mom. Yeah. We're so happy for you.
Yeah,
but
you're not going to be home.
Wait, so you're leaving again this month? Yeah, so they're very supportive, though.
So your best advice to somebody who might be viewing this, who might have kids at home, if you look back on how you did it, would you do it any differently? Would you change it up a little bit? Give yourself a little bit of a reward doing your art a little sooner? What would you do differently?
Well, that's a great question, because at the time that I was transitioning like that, plein air events were kind of newer. And so the infrastructure that you've built, even reintroducing Plein Air Magazine, that's just really raised the awareness. And I think that anybody who is in my situation now has a better chance of getting into events. You could do a smaller weekend event. There's so many more. There's contests. You have the online contests. None of that was happening to the degree that it is now when I was starting out. So it was kind of an uphill battle. So I think the avenue is kind of wide open now. There's so much opportunity.
Big change. When we started the magazine, I don't think there were more than five events nationwide, maybe 6. But today there are over 250. So it's changed a lot. That means
changed a lot.
250 events means they got to get 15, 20, 30, 50, 60 artists for each event. That's a lot more opportunity.
A lot of opportunity. And there's really good cash money now. At first the prizes were $500, $1,000, that was considered top prize, and now you can have $10,000. Yeah.
Not bad for doing a couple paintings.
No, that's right. Not bad for a week's worth of work.
So you are, how would you categorize yourself as a painter?
Well, there's labels that you can put to that, painterly realism, but honestly, a big turning point for me, just going back a little bit in time also in the interview, I just feel like I'm learning more than ever. On the one hand, I know what I like, I know what my aesthetic is, but I feel like the more I think I know, better things happen when I start at ground zero and I approach just a painting as a curious thing. What if I did that? Hey, I'm going to try this. And I do my go-to subject matter, of course. I'm not reinventing the wheel each time. I don't mean to say that. But approaching things more as a scholar and trusting in the process. So, I'm exploring when I approach a campus.
Well, that's one of the things I've noticed about the artists that get to the top of their game is they never stop exploring. They're always experimenting. The ones that get stagnant are the ones that do the same thing over and over again year after year. But the ones who are, even top artists, the very, very top artists have told me that they'll take a workshop from someone else, someone who might even be considered a lesser artist than they are in some ways, but they know that this person has a gift in a particular area, or maybe not a gift, because I don't really believe it's about gifts as much as it is about passion and development, you know, putting in the time. And so they'll go learn from you, for instance, or from somebody else. I mean, I first learned about you from Scott Christensen. So you're on the radar of the big guns.
He's a wonderful person. He's a great example of somebody who never stops learning. And he says he learns from me, so what higher flattery is that?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, and your work is beautiful, and there's a lot to be learned from it. So are you a studio painter, a plein air painter, a both combination? You know, is there a way to delineate that?
I used to consider myself just a plein air painter. I actually started in watercolor, and I've transitioned into oils, but and it's one of the reasons I ended up taking Scott's workshop. I love the idea of taking workshops at intervals, regardless of where you're at. And sorry, I forgot the first part of the question.
I don't remember it either.
Okay, well, we're chatting anyway.
Hey, how about those Mets?
That's right. No, but just transitioning from watercolor to oil and having that curious mindset, I mean, that's what just continues to lead to some good things.
And why did you transition out of watercolor?
I think I was just curious about oils, and what was holding me back was the use of solvent. I found out I was allergic. I would get hives and kind of get dizzy, and so then I did a whole lot of research on different ways to approach your canvas and not use any type of solvent product whatsoever.
So let's talk about that. What would that be? What's that look like?
Well, it could be really simple in the fact that I just don't use solvent. So I use everything else. I'm using traditional oils, water mixable. I can even use some mediums, such as Gamblin solvent-free gel that does not contain solvent. Or you can be complex about it and say, I start with the water mixable underpainting and to mimic the look of the solvent. And then I actually, when I'm doing the idea of fat over lean, the underpainting is the watery stuff in the water mixable. And it all works pretty well. Sounds like I've got too much equipment to be working with there, but it works.
So in terms of plein air painting, for the people who might be watching this, they're not a plein air painter, maybe they don't even know about it or haven't experienced it. What do you learn if you have been painting in your studio your whole life, or in the back bedroom or whatever, and you maybe you're painting from photographs or copying other things? What happens when you start going outside? What changes?
Such a good question.
Thank you.
Plein air is like everything. I mean, it all has to start there.
Has to.
Yes, because as humans, we are outside, we're interacting with, I mean, nature's just the ultimate teacher. You can take as many workshops as you want, but you're just going to learn from going outside and seeing. Somebody could tell you till they're blue in the face and you're blue in the face, you know, here's how you paint a rock, here's how you paint a tree. But you just go out and you look at it. And then some of the ideas that you can almost see things click in people's brains when they're looking and a teacher is describing. It's like, oh, so that's what you mean when, and Carlson was talking about this, and you're like, yes, that's right. It's all coming together.
So for those who don't know who Carlson is?
Well, Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting is kind of what...
Published in what, 1930 or something?
Right. It's been reissued how many times? Like
it's a classic.
Dozen times. Yes, one would say he knows all the answers, but he's also of the school that you never stop learning. And he's still looking for answers as the book progresses. So we're trying to finish we're standing on his shoulders, in essence.
So when you write your book, and you have three primary principles that you have to communicate to people that are more essential than anything else, what would those three be?
Well, going outside and working plein air, I just don't think you can get enough of that. Even if nothing comes from the painting, just making the effort to put down some color bars and color notes. And then what we talked about, just continuing to learn. It doesn't mean grabbing unessential information, not just, let's learn, let's take a million workshops. You can take a workshop and not like what the teacher said, but actually you have learned something about yourself. So being mindful of your own values and your own aesthetic as somebody else is presenting information. And so that could be paintings on a wall in a museum, could be at a workshop, could be at the convention when somebody's talking or doing a demo. You can actually disagree with their choice of red. It's your prerogative, but be actively learning about yourself in that regard. So third thing, in fact, make time for some other hobbies. Sometimes I feel like art is so all-consuming. I mean, I've cut down on so many of my other hobbies. I try to do cooking and gardening. I'm down to just those other two things. They take up a little piece of the pie now.
What were the other ones?
Oh gosh, everything from horseback riding to quilting to I tried knitting, and yeah, I was into all types of stuff. But painting is number one now.
Well, the nice thing about gardening is you can create your still life subjects, right?
Right.
Go outside. So you mentioned the convention. The people watching this might not know what you meant when you said that.
Mm-hmm. So the Plein Air Convention that is being put on once a year, it's a big celebration of plein air, which is the idea of painting outside, just what got me so excited before.
And you're on the faculty.
Yes, I'm on the faculty this year, and it's the numbers were huge, the people that attended, but it's felt like an intimate gathering because you got to see some new people, old people that maybe you had seen before. It was great.
It's kind of, I think of it like Thanksgiving, it's like going home and being around this big giant table with all these people that, except, Uncle Harry's not there.
It's your kindred spirit family reunion, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, people who like the same things that you like, your tribe.
Yep, exactly. I remember you mentioning that, I think, and it's just at the address opening or closing, and it just couldn't be more true. You just kind of started getting warm and fuzzy in the room, like, oh, all these people like this stuff too. Yay.
Well, I think the community is such an important part of being an artist. And what tends to happen is that those of us who are not out participating in plein air groups or plein air paint outs is that we kind of get isolated. We get stuck at home. We're sitting in our studios and painting away, and oftentimes we're alone. It's just our families. Right. And I think that community seems to be a really important aspect for an artist, whether it's the Plein Air Convention, the idea of once a year, at least going and reconnecting with all these people. You're in community because you're going to some of the plein air events and connecting with other artists at those things, and also you're able to talk to collectors and so on.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. We're talking about that sense of community, because I think I used to think it was about what I was thinking and feeling, but you're right, it's connecting with other artists and being open to what they say. I learned from my students. I hope that my students are learning from me. And it's that sense of camaraderie, seeing what somebody else is excited about, hearing different presentations, snatches of conversation I heard in the hall in the Plein Air Convention. All of those things just kind of support your growth as an artist in maybe ways you don't know about until later. I think the full benefit is reached maybe 2 weeks after, when you're like, wow, I'm processing that.
Well, when I was developing this concept, I thought, I've gone to so many demos and things and watched them, but then I kind of forget what I learned. And what I thought is, if you can take it and apply it that day, so you're watching somebody famous like you on stage, and then you teach me how to make my painting sparkle or something, and then I go outside and I apply that. Not only do I apply it, but you're around, I can go find you and ask
Yeah.
you, hey, I need help here. But also, I'm cementing it in my head right then and there because there's so much information otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're right, over the next, I found that, for several weeks after, I'm like pulling things out that I picked up at the convention because I try to, even though I organize it, I'm trying to sit in on it because that's really why I created it, so I could go to something like
I
this.
know, I was going to say, so do you paint at the convention?
I do.
Oh, good,
Yeah.
good. I wondered that.
Yeah, it's very important to me, and yet I want to, be out and talking to people. But
Right.
yeah, I think that's, it's like this is what needed to be done. This is what I would like in my life, and that's quite frankly why I created it. I thought if I'd want it, some other people would want it. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
well, I was going to say, what you're touching on is that Zen moment where you're in the zone of doing the painting, and sometimes a trick or a tip that you saw, like at the demo, and you're like, oh yeah, I want to go try that. And the faster you can get in your zone, the better. So if somebody like just tips the scales to all of a sudden making your painting click and work for you, what a gift is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's really also cool to be out there, you're part of history. You're out there painting the Golden Gate Bridge, and there's like more painters than you've ever seen in your life together. And yet, if you walk, you take a break and you walk from painter to painter, you could walk and look at everyone and you would not see two paintings alike.
It's so true.
And it's kind of a great educational experience.
Well, and you can find little pockets of people. Like, it's great to see the whole crowd there, which is very exciting, and walk, here's a painting, here's a painting. But also, I heard of stories where people said, yeah, there were just 2 or 3 of us, and we went over the hill, and there was nobody around. It was so peaceful and quiet. So
Right.
you have, like, the big crowd and the hubbub if you want it, but you can also go find your little nook.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So for the people who are kind of at the beginning stages of learning, what's the best advice you can give them other than the 3 points you gave me before? What's the best advice is in terms of you're going to learn to paint, here's what you need to expect, here's what you need to maybe anticipate or expect, and here are the things that you really need to be focusing on.
Well, I've been teaching for 20 years, so I've seen a lot of beginners, and I think really your only requirement, because often people are like, I'm not sure I'm good enough, I'm not ready, and in a certain regard, you're never going to be ready, nor should you be. Part of the job of either a Plein Air Convention, a workshop, or even facing the blank canvas is, let's get over that fear that, okay, now we're just going to try. We're going to try to do this thing. And we're just going to be present and show up. So if somebody's nervous about the level of skill required to do something, I say all you really need is a positive attitude. Mm-hmm. I will show you which end of the paintbrush to use, not to worry.
The one with hair on it, right?
That's right. Actually, I use both sides of mine today. So
Yeah.
for my signature, I use the other end. But no, I'm just joking around. But it's a good question, and I think it's number one for beginners. They're worried I might not be good enough and everybody else is going to be better than me. But the person who does the workshop with a smile and just, I'm just going to try this, and maybe they come with no expectations as to performance, and they're the ones who are going to get the most out of it, because with no expectations, you just can go up, right?
Well, and I hear from people who do workshops that there are people who come to workshops and they'll watch the demo, but they're not doing anything that they're being taught. They're just kind of going in the path that they're comfortable with. But talk about the value of pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah, and people have different levels of doing that, I think. And as a teacher, I try to respect that. Mm-hmm. But I especially can speak personally, and that the more I push myself, the more I open myself up to trying to be comfortable with failure. Okay, I'm doing a demo now. Could be the worst painting ever. Could be. But let's just see what happens. Let's talk it through. And really, if you have certain tools, it could be very simple, like just knowing a little bit more about your materials or taking a workshop. Just that idea of getting over that hump and trying, I mean, it makes all the difference. I mean, it really does. You just have to be open to failure. It's a good thing. It doesn't have to be a bad thing.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing for me to learn when I started painting was that I would get really invested in the canvas that I had just created. You know, I'd fall in love with it for whatever reason, and it took an instructor coming over one day and then scraping everything off of it and saying, "Here, start over." And I was mortified.
Yeah.
But he said, "Look, you've got to get to the point where you're not worrying about whether it's good or bad right now.
Right.
You know, your drawing was off. You're never going to be able to fix it. Let's start over and get it right, and let me show you how." And so, not being invested in that canvas, because that, you know, we fall in love. We all fall in love with the cool things that we think we're doing until we look at them 20 years later.
Well, I think the cadence is, and people can attend the Plein Air Convention and be on any angle of the spectrum, but I think when you're a beginner, it just feels good to push paint around. So, you know, yeah, get a knife and just squish it around. That's a great painting because you had fun.
That's right.
And there's something to be said for that exuberance on canvas. And then as you progress as a student, if you're asking questions, if you're checking in with yourself, if you're observing nature, you say, yes, but how do I get the sunlight to fall on that tree? Exactly just so. I'm curious. I would be willing to fail on many yellow tree paintings in order to find the answer to that question. So then you start progressing along. Then you have expectations about your painting. So this is when, you know, you've left the pure exuberance. I've actually heard people say, I used to have more fun painting. I'm so frustrated now. And I say, it's okay because you're learning. Let's check in with you. Doesn't that feel good? And they're like, oh, yes, it does. So.
Yeah, I was painting I had a small study that I did in Canada in the mountains, and I did a big painting of it, and I had done part of it, and it was going really well, and the trees were looking really good. And my wife walked into my studio, and she said, don't mess with those trees. Those are perfect. And the minute she said that, I had to mess with them.
Oh.
And not because of her, but I realized that the trees were drawing all the attention in the painting, and they weren't supposed to.
Oh.
And even though I had done them well, I thought, well, if I did them once, I can figure out how to do it again. And
that's a good
so
attitude.
I scraped it down and redid it and redid the drawing and changed everything. And it's still a bad painting, but it.
Oh, come on.
No, but it won't always be, right?
Okay.
But in other words, you have to be willing to be flexible.
So you're enjoying the process.
Not always. I mean, do you have moments when you're painting and you go,
sure.
oh, I should give this up?
Right. There's always moments when you think, what did I just do? I don't understand. How did that happen?
Yeah. Well, for me, it's when I'm getting lazy. Like, you know, if I'm tired or I haven't put enough paint out and I'm like trying to make other colors work because I don't want to go get another tube of paint. Or, you know, so I think that you got to get away from it once in a while. You have to give yourself some breathing room. It's not always easy to do if you're in a quick draw or something, but.
I know, speaking of quick draw, I love quick draw.
You do?
I do. I'm like one of the freaky individuals that loves that.
Yeah, you like pressure?
I never would have thought so. Here we are here I am having to do my demo. And even teaching, I was extremely shy, totally introverted. I would never be able to talk and paint at the same time. This was me long ago. And so I think it's been, baby steps to overcome that. Mm-hmm. And watercolor teaches you something. You can't really be afraid with watercolor because it shows on the page.
Yes, everything shows.
And so what I found at the Plein Air quick draws is that you just don't have time to second guess everything. There's time to slow down. This is what happens with my studio paintings. I slow way down, I reassess everything. It's a different experience. And to some degree, my ultimate experience is it feels very pure. The Plein Air quick draw, it just squeezes everything out of me. All my creativity comes out. And it just feels so good. And I'm in just pure paint mode. There's almost no cerebral, it's just complete reaction. And you could think of it as practice versus performance. You know, I've been practicing, I have all my skills, I've done my learning, and then poof, there's my performance. So I don't know, it feels good. What can I say? Maybe I'm an adrenaline junkie. I don't know.
Well, that's good.
Closet adrenaline junkie.
Well, I think that one of the things I've learned is if you think too much, sometimes you create problems for yourself. You know, when you're under the pressure, you're operating on instinct, not so much just thinking about everything. You know, it's like the best paintings I've ever done in my life were 15-minute paintings.
There you go.
Where I had, the sun was going down, the wind was blowing, I'm holding the easel down with one hand, and it's like in psychotherapy, they do these things to distract you so that your brain is, I've never been, well, okay, maybe that one time, but it's this idea that you know, you're not overcompensating for things because you're just like big brushstrokes
It's
trying to get it
instinct.
down. And sometimes those are the best, most
Yep.
beautiful paintings.
I think that's exactly it. That complements what I was trying to describe before. That moment of just gestural, this and that. And that's when we're talking about plein air, when we're talking about the convention, that's basically what's on everybody's mind, is that moment where it's pure reaction to the scene. You're just so overcome with excitement to capture that on canvas. How do you school yourself so that you can do that? How do you let yourself go so that you could do that? And how do you just be present? I mean, you were there on that mountaintop doing your quick thing. That's why that happened, because you had showed up and let it happen.
Right.
Yeah.
You got to put yourself out there.
You have to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any final words for our friends out there?
Well, it's just been a great experience. I mean, one mental trick I was doing for myself this week was, hey, it's a week-long quick draw. Bring it on. We're going to have fun and make these videos. So I'm looking forward to the same for the Plein Air Convention. Can't wait.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, we're honored to have you here. It's really fun watching your career, and I just know it's just going to continue to soar.
Thanks,
I
Eric.
think people are going to love what you do, and it's just terrific to get to know you a little bit.
Wow, thanks so much for having me out. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
That was Paintings That Sparkle with Christine Lashley. I hope you're having a good day, and remember, keep your head in the game and keep focused on your art. I'm Eric Rhodes.
Brushstrokes. Loose, rich brushstrokes give a painting life. Abstract shapes. Loosely rendered scenery. Colorful passages. Soft edges. Bright reflections. It's the language of painting, and once you discover how to paint loosely and with feeling, you'll experience newfound freedom and growth as an artist. If you're looking for something new and fresh to challenge you, look no further than Christine Lashley. We learned about her from artist Scott Christensen, who told us she was one of the artists he was watching and impressed with because of her unique command of painting. Just look at these paintings. To capture a scene with such delicate beauty requires a light touch and an understanding of how to place all the elements together perfectly, a skill very few have ever mastered. Now Christine will show you exactly how to create the energy, movement, glimmer, and drama that brings any scene to life, whether bright daylight, moody fog, or a nighttime scene.
It's really where I learned about the power of how to create light and get the vibrancy in your paintings.
From the initial concepts of how to capture light and reflections, to simple tips for painting figures in proper perspective. Christine guides you step by step through a complete painting with attention to color, temperature, and value for added dramatic effects.
And maybe this is going to be a better start to the mixture, and then slicing this off like a piece of cake here.
Christine Lashley is not only known as one of the top painters on the scene today, she is a masterful instructor who has received national recognition and awards for her tremendous ability to paint light, and believing no subject is too hard for any skill level artist to paint. Christine breaks up the steps so you can practice right along with her.
Easy thing that you can do to prepare for painting that you're going to create is go out, experience the scene, maybe make a quick memory study, and I'll show you a little bit about that later.
Soon, you'll have a better understanding of the techniques it takes to use color and value for maximum impact, to paint with a more dramatic flair, and how using looser brushstrokes will allow you to be more expressive and make your paintings sparkle. Incorporate Christine's methods to infuse your paintings with vibrant energy and life. Paintings that Sparkle with Christine Lashley. Available on DVD and digital to view on your computer, tablet, or smartphone. Order yours today.